So welcome to the third webinar from the Office of Global Partnerships in a series highlighting the different regions where our partnership officers work. My name is Jenny Grant, and I serve as the Officer for Global Relations and Networking. Today, we'll be hearing from the Partnership Officer who oversees Jerusalem and the Middle East. But before we get started and I turn it over to David Copley, our Director, I just want to go over a couple housekeeping items. The first thing is, as I mentioned, this webinar will be recorded and available to view later on the Global Mission Digital Toolkit, which I will put the link for in the chat. The second thing is, if you have any technical problems or anything, if you need anything, please feel free to send me a message and I will do my best to help sort that out. And then finally, throughout the webinar, if you have any thoughts or any questions as you hear our panelists, please feel free to share those in the chat. And as we have time at the end, we'll come back to those questions and hopefully get as many of those answered during our discussion time as possible. So thank you again for being here, and I will turn it over to David Copley.
Thank you, Jenny, and welcome again from the Office of Global Partnerships. The Office of Global Partnerships has two principal goals in terms of its ministry. One is to be a bridge between the Episcopal Church and our brothers and sisters around the Anglican Communion, and also to be a resource for parishes, dioceses, and institutions of the Episcopal Church to help nurture their relationships as they develop. And during this time of COVID, it's probably more important than ever to remember, when we think about who is my neighbor, that neighbor really shouldn't have any geographical boundaries. It's very easy during times of difficulty and challenge that we've had with COVID to look within ourselves. It's a good reminder that we should be looking outside of ourselves always, and that as children of God, our brothers and sisters live all over the world, including in Jerusalem in the Middle East. So I'm honored and privileged to introduce our Partnership Officer for the Middle East, Canon Bob Edmonds. He's been our Middle East Partnership Officer since 2011. And prior to that, he served with his wife for 3 years. He served as the chaplain to the Anglican bishop in Jerusalem and canon pastor for the Cathedral of St. George's, also in Jerusalem. Before his posting in the Middle East, he served congregations in Massachusetts and Western New York. And he holds a Master's of Divinity from Yale Divinity School in New Haven, Connecticut. Bob, I wonder if you could start off this conversation by just sharing about the region in which you work.
Thank you, David. I appreciate it very much. It's a great joy to be with you and all the folks who are participating in this webinar. Jenny's going to run a, Jenny's going to run a PowerPoint for us in a few minutes, which will provide a lot of information about the ministry of the province, throughout the province of Jerusalem and the Middle East. And then I'll provide a different kind of information in my verbal comments in a moment as a way to augment and complement what you'll see on the PowerPoint. I will not be going slide by slide. Our thought was that you could get more information in this two-track approach, one through the slideshow and then also through what I have to offer verbally. So Jenny, take it away with the slideshow and we'll start. This is great. A lot of what I have to do is in my work is to interpret the needs and challenges of Christians in the province of Jerusalem in the Middle East with the Episcopal Church. And then going back the other way to help interpret the needs and realities and challenges of our work in the Episcopal Church with our brothers and sisters throughout the Middle East. There are three basic dioceses, and you see them on the screen. One is the Diocese of Iran, with whom we have a very almost a hands-off relationship due to the political realities between the U.S. and Iran these past 40 or more years. Our closer relationship is with the Diocese of Jerusalem and the Diocese of Cyprus and the Gulf. If I were to condense my work into 3 words, it would come down to interpretation and advocacy and partnership. As a consequence, I'm in regular contact with the Archbishop of Jerusalem and the Archbishop in Cyprus and the Gulf and members of their staff. I work closely with our mission staff who are on assignment in both dioceses, working in parishes and diocesan positions. I spend time supporting members of our Young Adult Service Corps, sometimes called YASKers, of the Episcopal Church, also on assignment throughout the region. I'm in touch regularly with the Office of Government Relations of the Episcopal Church in Washington, D.C., and Rebecca Linder Blatchley, who directs that office, and we consult on letters and statements in support of stated positions of the Episcopal Church to support humanitarian aid, human rights, and resolutions of the General Convention and Executive Council in relation to our State Department and our presidential administration, in this case, the Bidens. I'm also in touch with, as you might imagine, because we have so much interfaith work and ecumenical work in that region, that I'm in touch with the ecumenical interreligious deputy, the presiding bishop, the Reverend Margaret Rose, on a regular basis as well. Linnea Main is our Episcopal Church representative with the United Nations, and Linnea and I are also in touch frequently. In addition to that, there are members of the Global Partnerships team. As David outlined a moment ago, I'm in touch with them all the time in ways of mutual support for our various ministries. You've all heard of the United Thank Offering. Well, the Reverend Heather Melton and her team provide grants of support throughout the province of Jerusalem, Middle East as well. So we're in touch, as does Episcopal Relief and Development. And I'm thankful to Nagalan Nasea for his support of our work there as well. In addition to all those people, there are other organizations made up of Episcopalians who focus a lot of their time and energy on ministry in the Middle East, including the Palestine-Israel Network of the Episcopal Peace Fellowship, Stand with Iraqi Christians, and American Friends of the Episcopal Diocese of Jerusalem. I'm in touch with all those folks on a regular basis as well, among others. Then outside the Episcopal Church, I'm also a member of the board of the Churches for Middle East Peace organization. I participate regularly with the Middle East Ecumenical Forum, made up of colleagues in various denominations who work in the Middle East issues. And also, I'm in touch from time to time with World Council of Churches staff in Jerusalem. And in my spare time, I also work with the Communications and Development Office in supporting and implementing the Good Friday offering, which happens every year on Good Friday, hence the name, which benefits the diocese of the province of Jerusalem in the Middle East, and is a tangible witness every year of our solidarity with Christians in that region. And the Good Friday offering, which is kind of wonderful to note, will turn 100 years old next year. So the centennial will be an exciting time to be a part of that ministry as well. Okay, that's what I do a lot of. Well, what about the Christians that we're working with? Who are these people? And well, here they are. The indigenous Christians, mostly Arab, take pride in saying that they have been Christians since the first Pentecost. It's a common misunderstanding and misconception that Christians in the region are converts from Islam. This is simply not the case. Christians in the Middle East have been there from the very beginning. The term Christian presence is used a lot, and it's an important phrase, Christian presence, because throughout the region, Christians make up a tiny percentage of the population in most countries. Cyprus is an exception, with a Christian majority in the southern part of that island, and Lebanon, of course, has a significant Christian presence, though not a majority. Some Christians in the Middle East are indigenous and Arab, as I note, particularly Palestinians living in the occupied territories, Israel, and a very few in Gaza. They are also Jordanian, Syrian, Lebanese, and Iraqi. And Arab Anglicans in this region, of course, worship in their native language, which is Arabic. From time to time, you might find yourself in a worshiping community which is able to provide a bilingual service in Arabic and English, and that works amazingly well. In fact, it's a lot of fun. Some Christians in the Middle East are indigenous, but they are Cypriot, as I mentioned a moment ago. Cyprus has a lot of Christians. Most of them are Greek Orthodox, and a few are Anglican. Some Christians in the Middle East are expats from all over the world. This is true in both of the dioceses we work with the most, but particularly in the Diocese of Cyprus and the Gulf, where guest workers keep the economies going throughout the Gulf states. From Kuwait to Bahrain and Qatar, the United Arab Emirates and Oman, tens of thousands of people from India, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, the Philippines, and elsewhere staff a wide variety of businesses in hospitality and construction and other things to keep the economies of the Gulf states going. And many of them, of course, are Christians. The Diocese of Cyprus in the Gulf hosts dozens of churches in their facilities. It's hard to believe, but some of these facilities resemble convention centers in size, so that Christians far from home are able to worship in their language and in their tradition, which is so important, especially if you're far from home. And this, of course, is in addition to the Anglican worship, which the Diocese of Cyprus the Gulf provides for English-speaking nationalities. Well, what about the context in which we function? Well, it's interesting to me. The Middle East is always in the news, and even today, and today's date is April 21st of 2021. Today, on the front page of the New York Times, is this headline: Iran rattled as Israel strikes again and again. This is the context in which our people function. Christians function in this, it's a challenging world. Let me give you some ideas about this. Recent developments in the past few weeks have included the following. In Jordan, you may have heard about the disruption between King Abdullah and his half-brother, which has caused grave concerns. Jordan is home to tens of thousands of refugees, Palestinians from wars in 1948, 1967, Iraqis from the past almost 20 years of conflict, and Syrians from the civil war of the past 10 years. Jordan is a key to stability in the region and an area which is clearly unstable. So having a rift in the royal family in Jordan is a great cause for concern. In Syria, the civil war has quieted down off the front page of the news most of the time, but the question before all of us is, will the current partition of that country be the new normal? And you may have heard that President Assad is going to run again for office in May. Well, we'll see how their election goes. In Lebanon, you may have heard of this as well. Lebanese currency has declined in value by 80% in recent months. Fears of a total banking collapse are rife and great concern for all the Lebanese people. Gaza, you've heard of Gaza. Gaza continues in its isolation and poverty. These are access to healthcare and every conceivable economic benefit is at risk all the time in Gaza, which brings up the whole Palestinian-Israel impasse, an ongoing source of concern and frustration for so many of us. Home demolitions continue by the Israeli government in East Jerusalem and elsewhere. Further annexation of the West Bank continues to be a concern. Settlement expansion is ongoing, and the ongoing conflict continues to find no real solution yet. We pray for the people of Palestine. In Yemen, perhaps you've also heard of Yemen, another garden spot of great conflict, perhaps the greatest humanitarian crisis ongoing right now anywhere. In addition to all of that, the various relationships between the Gulf states are in flux, especially in relation to Iran, as I mentioned with Israel a moment ago. All of it's in flux. And Iraq continues to try to stabilize out of the chaos of their recent past. So what's the response to the dioceses that are there? Well, in Jerusalem, the Diocese of Jerusalem has over 30 institutions of education and healthcare throughout the diocese in Gaza, Israel, East Jerusalem, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. The whole emphasis is about the love of Jesus for all of God's children. Mutual respect, tolerance, and service are emphasized in all possible ways. They see themselves as a bridge to understanding and future opportunity for all of God's people. In the Diocese of Cyprus and the Gulf, through offering hospitality to Christian churches and their facilities up and down the Persian Gulf, as I mentioned, and providing a home away from home for tens of thousands of fellow Christians, they put forward the idea that Jesus' love is for all of God's children as well. In addition, the Diocese of Cyprus and the Gulf has a health ministry in Yemen, an eye clinic, which is still open, staffed by dedicated Muslim professionals, even in spite of the war. And both dioceses work closely with ecumenical partners, interfaith partners, government agencies, aid organizations, and Anglican Communion partners as well. What's that their response tends to be? What about our response? What are we called to be about? Well, I would suggest two things we can be doing. One is to be aware, and secondly is to be involved. For instance, be aware of the Office of Government Relations work in Washington. This is the Episcopal Church's liaison with the State Department and the executive branch of the government. I would suggest to you there's good news here in the past few weeks. Letters and statements in recent weeks to the Biden administration to restore funding for UNRWA, the United Nations Relief Works Agency, which is the organization, UN organization, which supports relief for refugees, particularly Palestinian refugees. Restoration of their funding, which was cut under the Trump administration, has been restored by Biden. And we sent a letter in support of that. And then we sent a letter following that, thanking them for that. Letters to support seeking humanitarian aid in Yemen and the suspension of arms sales to Saudi Arabia to slow the conflict. And Bishop Curry has signed on to a Churches for Middle East peace letter recently on a host of Middle East issues, to re-engage in talks with Iran, to reestablish diplomatic relationships with the Palestinian Authority, to reiterate U.S. objections to settlement expansion and the illegality of those settlements under international law, and further efforts to bring relief to the people of Syria, among other topics. This is all good news. This is part of what your Episcopal Church does to affect public policy in the Middle East. So being aware of that is helpful. Also, be involved. You can be involved with the Office of Government Relations through the Episcopal Public Policy Network, or EPPN, to be made aware of issues of interest coming before the legislators in Congress that you would like to put your voice behind. I would also encourage you to be aware of the Palestine-Israel Network of the Episcopal Peace Fellowship, working and advocating for peace in the region. Also, Churches of Middle East Peace has an active program which you can be participating in. There are many other organizations as well. I just name a few to get your thoughts going. And I would also say to you, we can gain a new understanding by being involved with and giving generously as you're able to do, the American Friends of the Episcopal Diocese of Jerusalem, Stand with Iraqi Christians, and participating in the United Thank Offering and Episcopal Relief and Development campaigns. And then, of course, I have to also include the Good Friday offering, which just took place a few weeks ago. This is, again, an annual tangible opportunity for tangible support for funds and prayers, advocacy and witness to support the ministry of our sisters and brothers in the Middle East. Lots of opportunity. We are not left without hope, and we have possibilities to take action on our own. These are just some of those examples. Well, without further ado, let us now hear from Archbishop Suhail, followed by Archbishop Michael Lewis from Cyprus, and hear what they have to say about their take on these topics in their diocese. Thank you very much.
Warm greetings and peace from here, Jerusalem, the rest of Jerusalem. This is Archbishop Suhail. I'm sending greetings to all our brothers and sisters from the Episcopal Church here, to our brothers and sisters in the Episcopal Church of America. Greetings from me and Bishop Co-Tutor Hussein Na'oum and our diocese, parishes, institutions. Greetings to you all from here, from Jerusalem.
About the hope we find in our ministry at this time, talking about hope, we always say that to live in Jerusalem is the city of the resurrection and the city of hope. Our power comes from our risen Lord. We find hope also from all our partners, our brothers and sisters in Christ, who pray for us and support our ministry right here in this region. Personally, my greatest joy comes from our diocesan ministries to those who are unprivileged, especially to the children with disabilities. Uh, we have maybe 4 or 5 institutions who look after children with disabilities. We have one in Beirut, we have two in Jordan, we have Princess Basma here, and other schools. I always say that when I visit these institutions, they always give us hope, and their smiles bring us joy and happiness when we go and visit these children who are really in need. So this is a great ministry that we are carrying on here in this diocese. If we speak about our challenges to sustain our ministries here for the institutions, as you know that we run hospitals, schools, rehabilitation centers, and vocational schools. The pandemic decreased our revenues and incomes by 50%, and the donors' money dwindled. So this is a very big challenge to our ministry here in this diocese. The other challenge we face is really the same always concern for us, how to preserve the Christian presence in the land of the Holy One. As everybody knows, uh, our presence here no more than 1% of the total population, and the number is even with this coronavirus. Also, many families now who are really in need, and some of them maybe they look for a better future outside this region. So this is really another challenge for all the churches in this land. Another challenge that we face here when church families ask for help from the church during these difficult times, and the church is not able to meet their needs for food or for school fees, medical treatment, etc. So maybe on daily basis, I face these demands from our families. As you know that our budget is very limited and our sources are really limited, but we help in whatever way we can. This is also a big challenge for the church here. Uh, as I said before, we appreciate the Episcopal Church and what they are doing to help us in this region and this diocese. So I want our Episcopalians, brothers and sisters, to know about our faith in action. Our faith in action comes from the hospitals, rehabilitation centers, schools for children and disabilities we run. I want our friends to know that about our 28 parishes, including a new church we just opened in Upper Galilee in January. I want them to know about our youth and children's programs during this year, and the camps during the summer times. So the church here responsible, besides that we have 28 parishes, we run more than 30 institutions of institutions that offer services to the whole community. And in our services, we don't discriminate. We offer services to those who are in need, regardless of their religion, color, or gender. We really, as I said, faith in action. This is what we really do in this diocese. Uh, and I ask our brothers, sisters, and brothers in America, Episcopalians, to pray for our Christian presence and witness, for peace and justice in this land, and for wise leaders and good friends. So these are really our ministry and our concern at this time. Again, we send our gratitude and thanks to you all for what you are doing to this diocese and to this region. May God bless you. Goodbye.
And greetings from the Middle East. My name's Michael Lewis, and I'm speaking from the Diocese of Cyprus and the Gulf. So all my greetings and all blessings to everybody in the USA, everybody watching this, everybody in tech. I'm going to talk a bit about the Diocese of Cyprus and the Gulf, A, because I'm Bishop of it, and B, because I think it's absolutely unique and fascinating. Incidentally, I should mention that we are just one of the 3 Anglican dioceses that now make up the province of Jerusalem and the Middle East. Everybody's heard of the Diocese of Jerusalem, but that's only one bit. It's a great bit, but it's only one bit. And there's a lot of the rest of the Middle East that's served by our province. There's the Diocese of Iran. Until recently, we had the Diocese of Egypt, but they're a province on their own. And there's us, the Diocese of Cyprus and the Gulf. We cover a massive geography. If you ask me how many countries are in my diocese, interestingly, the answer could either be 9, 10, or 16. And that depends on how you count them. But anyway, the answer is rather a lot. There's one officially Christian country, that's Cyprus. I happen to be there at the moment. And if you can say that home is where your wife is, or home is where your domestic animals are, then it is Cyprus. But in a normal year, I'm traveling pretty constantly. Let me make a point about the Middle East and Christianity. I think most people are very familiar with the concept of the Christians of the Middle East. By which would be meant those who are indigenous to the region, Palestinians, Jordanians, Syrians, Lebanese, and others too. And we have some of those indigenous Christians, probably especially in the country of Iraq, which is fairly and squarely in my diocese of Cyprus and the Gulf. But as well as Christians of the Middle East, there are also plenty of other Christians who are in the Middle East. Now, in case that puzzles you, let me say what I mean by it. What I mean by it is Christians who were born in other places, or maybe even were born in these places, but are not in fact citizens of those countries. And that's the majority of Christians in my patch. That's the majority of Christians in countries like the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, Oman. It makes for a very interesting mix because, of course, those people who are not citizens of my countries come from any number of other countries, or their parents or their grandparents did. Some people imagine that the Christians in places like Abu Dhabi or Dubai or Kuwait are largely going to be some British expatriates and probably a good number of Texans working in oil and gas. Yes, there are some British expatriates. Yes, there are some Texans, and it's absolutely great that they are among us, but they're not the majority. If you asked for the biggest single country with passports among our regular worshippers, it would be India. What that means is that in almost all our locations, and it is actually true in Cyprus as well as the Arabian or the Gulf part of the diocese, what it means is that none of our worship services is homogeneous, not really. If you went, for example, to the Church of the Epiphany in Qatar, you'd probably find 30, 40 different nationalities represented. You'd have Pakistanis, you'd have Canadians, you'd have Venezuelans, you'd have people from Myanmar or Burma, from Australia, from Britain, from the States, but also most especially from India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and many more besides. Now, what about the notion that we can't practice our religion freely? The answer is that with one single exception, we don't have to be cloak and dagger. I won't spell out the single exception, but you can probably work it out for yourselves. But in all other countries, the deal for us Anglicans certainly is that we don't play clandestine Christianity. We don't play cloak and dagger because those countries are our hosts. All except Cyprus are descriptively or officially Muslim. So we have to not only recognize, but also take pleasure in the fact that we are hosted by Islam. And we're hosted in most cases very graciously indeed. So what about evangelism? Well, I would have to say that our evangelism is an evangelism of being present. It's an evangelism of faithful persistence in these lands. And it's an evangelism also of mission service. We are, of course, fragile in countries where we're not citizens because the rules could change. But where we can function, we do function. And almost everywhere we function, we flourish. Like everyone in the world at the moment, we're struggling in terms of movement. We're struggling financially, but we're not giving up. And so my message and greeting to tech and to anybody watching this in the form of clips is please pray for us. We certainly will pray for you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bob, for that presentation. The next person I'd like to welcome is Emma Wright. Emma, if you could just turn on your video so we can all see you. Wonderful. Emma was a young adult service corps volunteer at the Alamana Center in Muscat in Oman from 2019 to 2020. We often say to be a missionary, you have to take risks and go out of your comfort zone. And it sounds as if you started doing that at a younger age. Emma hiked the Appalachian Trail all the way through from the beginning to end. I'm not quite sure how far that is, but it's a 4.5-month hike as a through hiker. And then you wrote an undergraduate thesis on that. So congratulations on that. Probably good training for any kind of mission work. Emma is now a postulant from the Diocese of Virginia, studying at Berkeley Divinity School at Yale. So something very important in common with Bob. Berkeley Divinity School definitely has a specific interest and support of the work in Jerusalem and the Middle East. So you're definitely in good hands there. Emma, I wonder if you could share a little bit about your life and time in Oman. It's probably a place that very few of us know very much about. And we'd be interested to hear about your experiences.
Absolutely. Thanks, David. So as Michael was just saying, a lot of the countries in the Gulf have large Christian populations of expat workers, migrant workers, and that's certainly the case in Oman because almost half the population is not Omanis, which means that the way in which Christianity is practiced is this wonderful blend of traditions from all over. That's exemplified in the fact that Oman doesn't have an Anglican church per se that is distinct from other things. There's what's called the Protestant Church in Oman, PCO, that has an Anglican priest and two other priests actually that all collaborate. My role there though was at an interfaith center that was Christian run, and it's called Al-Amana Center. It's in Muscat, and the work is primarily running short-term programs with groups that visit for 1 to 2 weeks from all over the world to engage in interfaith dialogue and cross-cultural immersion, experiential learning, all with the goal of building greater trust and peace among peoples of faith, especially between Christians and Muslims. The first question I frequently get talking about this experience from people is, did I feel safe as a single young woman Christian by myself there? And the answer is absolutely yes. More so than most cities I've lived in the US. It's a wonderful environment to live in with hospitality as a value that is uplifted daily. And during my time there, I described my job to a class of kindergartners once as a professional friendship builder, because that's really what it felt like I was spending my time doing. Of these groups would come in. One week we might have Muslim and Christian military chaplains from Nigeria. And then the next week, Muslim, Christian, Hindu, and Sikh religious leaders from Pakistan. And the next week, Finnish university students. It was all over the place. And I spent my time talking to people and organizing logistics and hiking through wadis and the mountains and camping in the desert and facilitating sessions of scriptural reasoning and trauma healing. And as you may guess, based on my description, that the program was largely people traveling from abroad. Pandemic definitely changed the nature of the work. And it also opened a lot of new opportunities for collaboration. So now the center is doing interfaith dialogue with participants from the US, UK, Bangladesh, Oman, Pakistan, Nigeria, like all at once, when we can find a time zone that works. And I've continued to remain involved with some of those conversations. As I think a little bit about what my time at the center taught me, or the questions that it raised for what partnerships across the Anglican Communion mean, why are they important? I can't help but think back to the first day of classes this semester. One of my professors posed the question, do you identify as Episcopalian, Anglican, both, or neither, to us? And this is a class on the history and theology of the Anglican Communion. Without a moment of hesitation, I clicked both. I think simply because I use the terms interchangeably anytime I'm out of the US, it seems simpler. But as I sat with the question, the more interesting thing to me became, why does this question matter? Why does the question matter enough that my professor would even pose it and spend time on it? Why does it matter if I identify as Episcopalian and Anglican? And I think for me, it's not just in the labels, but in the embracing of all the tensions that come with that. As I was saying, Oman, at the center I worked at, no two people were from the same denomination. And so all of us were held slightly different beliefs about things we cherished, and being able to have a home in one denomination or in one cultural expression of a denomination, i.e. your specific Episcopal church, and work together, be in relationship, I think for me is the purpose of shared Christian community. And then also there was the aspect that being in Oman, it was an interfaith community in addition to collaborating just across the communion. And I think frequently I've noticed that interfaith work and Anglican Communion relationship building work gets totally separated and categorized into distinct categories, when in my mind they are absolutely interwoven and challenging us to do the same work of being open to new perspectives and a little bit of letting our guards down to be open to other lenses of engaging with God. So my best friend in Oman, her name is Sumaya, and we spent endless hours sitting on the majlis, which is these cushions on the floor, just with my Bible and her Quran and her husband was my Arabic teacher, so she would always try to make me read as much of it as I could, which never went well because Quranic Arabic is so beautiful and so complicated. But we would sit there with these two things side by side and not try to come to a consensus of what the answer is, but try to support each other in her helping me to be the best Christian I can be, me helping her to be the best Muslim I can be. And in the same way, I don't think the goal of the Anglican Communion is to come to consensus of one way to say words, one way to move our bodies during worship, but rather to help one another be the best version of church, of followers of Jesus that we can be. And that's something that Sumaya taught me and continues to teach me, because we still Zoom every single Wednesday. That's been a tradition since I moved back to the US. And yeah, I think I'll maybe leave it there. Those are some of my thoughts. And I encourage you to ask any questions in the chat, whether it's about Oman specifically, the interfaith relationships there, or the Diocese of Cyprus and the Gulf. Happy to answer them as best as I can. Thanks.
Thank you, Emma. I was particularly struck about your question about Episcopalian and Anglican, and I think especially for those who travel a great deal, I've always said in terms of identity to encourage people to look at their birth certificate rather than their baptismal, than their passport. Look at their birth certificate rather than their baptism certificate. So your faith is more important than the nation you were born in, perhaps, and that we're all children of God as well. So not just being Christian, but being a child of God. So there's interfaith conversations as children of God, whether you're Christian, Hindu, Muslim. I think is a really important learning for all of us, I think. I'd be just interested with the experiences that you've had. How have you seen the importance of prayer in the Episcopal Church and in our culture? I don't know if we appreciate prayer as often as people of different faiths and different cultures do.
Yeah, that's a great question, because I definitely spent a lot of time thinking about prayer. In the neighborhood that I was living in Muscat, you could hear the Islamic call to prayer 5 times a day from probably 10 mosques that I could see the minaret tower if I was outside, but probably more than that. It's echoing all over. And that pauses any program that we were ever running. The call to prayer goes, we wrap up whatever little bit we are doing and take a break so that people can pray. That doesn't happen at seminary. We have a little bit of a routine, but certainly not 5 times a day, which raises the question of what is the role of prayer in each tradition? What purpose are we seeking through it? I think I very much grew up with the petitionary kind of approach to prayer of, oh, I need something, I'm sad, I should probably pray about it. And then I think during college, when I was feeling perhaps more frustrated with God, I was like, why bother spending time praying? Because I don't even know if I know how that works. And I don't even know how I feel about God these days. So like, what's the point? And I think I learned from my friends in Oman the value of showing up for prayer, even when you don't feel like it, of believing that God is at work, even when I don't feel God's presence at all, or even when I don't know that I believe that prayer works. And just being in the rhythm that Sumaya and Mohammed have bad days and weeks where they're angry or lamenting or what have you, but it's part of their tradition, part of their practice to show up for prayer anyway. Also, there's a belief, at least in the body Islam that's practiced, or that I learned about, prayer's not meant to be difficult. And kind of the God gets it angle. And so that also, having grace with myself as to what form my prayer takes and what form my prayer life takes, makes the question that used to give me goosebumps of, how is your prayer life from a bishop or spiritual director? A lot less intimidating.
Yeah, I think we can be a little too prescriptive sometimes in terms of prayer. I always loved Mother Teresa's answer to that question when she was asked, how does she pray? And she says, what does she say when she prays? And she said, well, I don't say anything. I just listen to God. And then they asked, well, and what does God say? Oh, God doesn't say anything. God just listens. And there are many different ways of praying.
I think in many ways, the Appalachian Trail was a 2,000-mile labyrinth of prayer. Felt like that many a time.
Yeah, I can definitely, understand that. Bob, can you turn your video back on? There's a question here that I think would be great if you could respond to. Bishop Michael kind of mentioned about evangelism, but I just wondered if you would like to elaborate on the question, the word evangelism. Oh, and the question's just
a great question. I'm interested. Archbishop Michael brought that up. A lot of people feel that unless we are sharing the gospel and converting people to Christianity, that we're not doing our job. What's interesting, from my experience living in Jerusalem for 3 years, a lot of Jewish people, a lot of Muslim people are very curious about Jesus. The whole God's part of the fabric of the community. Particularly the Muslim call to prayer a couple times a day, and the call to Shabbat on Fridays. You have, it's just infused, so you're always having theological conversations. And as far as the ministry of Christians in the region is concerned, it isn't about converting people, it's about mutual respect and understanding and sharing our sense of God is about through Jesus. People are curious. They kind of want to know, who is your Jesus to you is kind of a question. So the sense of sharing our Christian faith is really brought about by as has been identified earlier, is about who is our neighbor. Our neighbor is everybody, and we want to support and be good and faithful servants of Christ by serving our neighbors. This is a common understanding, and so when we talk about schools or hospitals or clinics, it's about serving the needs of our neighbors, whoever they are. So if that's evangelistic, then so be it. If it's about sharing who we are as a Christian faithful people, that's really what it's about. It's about promoting the understanding that everybody can respect that I am Jewish, I am Muslim, I am Christian, and this is why, and enjoy that relationship as Emma was describing. It's wonderful. People really are kind of curious.
Yeah.
Hope that's helpful.
Yeah, no, and I think you're absolutely right. And I think that not being shy about your faith, people are if you're sharing your faith respectfully, people respect you more if you are passionate about your own faith, and share that. Emma, there's a question in the chat, not an easy question, but it just in terms of have you had conversations in your interfaith groups when you hear about terrorist attacks from various extremist groups to others?
Yeah, we have, and it became very tangible while I was there in January of 2020. There was violence flying with our neighbors across the water in Iran. And so there were questions at the center of, would nearby US military bases be a target? And so we definitely spent some time talking about this. And the question is, how does your interfaith group respond if a terrorist attack occurs against Christians? And I think I would say, first, we lament, we mourn. I think a terrorist attack against anyone is heartbreaking. And I think that conversations follow about what is actually driving the attack. Because the Islam that I know and that I love is not encouraging violent conversions, violence against anyone. It truly is, especially Ibadi Islam, one of the most tolerant faith traditions I've encountered, more welcoming of every type of Christian than most Christians in the US, I think. And I think that you can't ignore, you can't write it off as, well, they're not a real Muslim if they're claiming that faith behind it. But what you can do is look at what is the version of Islam that they are following, because there's not just one way of experiencing, believing, practicing Islam, worshiping Allah, just like there's not one way of practicing Christianity. And boy, oh boy, have Christians used our religion for so much violence in the past. And I think it's important to hold that as you hold the ones occurring right now.
Yeah, I think that's important to remember. We don't, condone any violence, but the doctrine of discovery in the 15th century was a justification for global colonialization by the Christians in Europe, all over the world. It's something to remember.
Just to pile on for just a quick second, I think the great struggle we work with here is really about extremism. Extremism, whether it expressed through Islam or Christianity or Judaism, is a negative. It's bad when it goes to violent ends. And there's something, passion is one thing, but violent extremism expressed in any of these traditions is a real bad thing. And we've seen evidences of it in all three. And it's so whenever, as Emma says, when anybody is affected by any kind of violence of this nature, it's heartbreaking. And we've got to do everything we can to seek ways of understanding, which is where we're back to the ministry is of the region of Christians. It's about developing that level of tolerance, and more than that, about acceptance for each other. That's so essential.
Yeah, that's good to remember. There's a question here about COVID vaccines. I don't know if you know anything about this, Bob. COVID vaccine availability for Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank.
I don't have any specific information about what is happening with that exactly in terms of advocating in support of COVID, of the vaccines being distributed. I know some of the staff at the hospital in Nablus and in Gaza, and I know the health director of the Diocese of Jerusalem. I'm confident that they are working very hard at seeing to the vaccine distributions going on, being aware that it's controlled by the Israelis, and that thereby is yet one more political hurdle to deal with, is how to deal with the Israeli government and distribution of these things. I know, I'm aware that our government's putting some heat on the Israelis to deal with that in an equitable fashion. But the specifics of that, I do not have up-to-date information on that.
Okay, thanks, Bob. I think it is also good to mention that our advocacy office in Washington, D.C. is working very hard in terms of working for the advocacy for vaccine justice globally. Presiding Bishop Michael Curry has been in conversation with the primate of Southern Africa, Thabo Makova, who has lifted up this issue globally. So the Anglican Communion and the Episcopal Church is very active in terms of vaccine justice in general. And we hope that our Office of Government Relations, I'm sure they will lift that issue up to the US government as well. So that is something that we're very actively involved with. Given, just a generic question here, given all the challenges that everybody's talked about in Jerusalem, the income going down, the issues of COVID, the issues of terrorism, question for both of you, where do you see hope? Emma, in the work that you've done with YASC and Bob in the region in general, I just wonder if you have any sort of anecdotes of where do you see hope coming in these challenging times?
Take it away, Emma. all about a cleanup.
I think there's lots of cause for hope, and not just because I trend towards more optimistic as a human being, but because in the region, in every different sphere I was operating, I felt fully embraced. I felt like it was a home. I didn't feel like a visitor. And by every circle, I mean at the center, with my Muslim friends and Omani friends, with Gulf Churches fellowship activities and with the diocese there who invited me to come to their annual synod. It's just, there's an eagerness, I think, that is bubbling up to get to know each other really, not just the polite, how are you, fine, we move on, but to really build those personal relationships that allow us to talk about hard things and remain in relationship with each other. And that's something that I know I didn't grow up learning in school or Sunday school necessarily, but am continuing to build that skill set. And I think a lot of other people are eager to engage in that work as well, of how to remain in relationship when we don't agree and how to learn and grow through that process together. And so I know I feel hopeful and excited to see where that energy leads us as a church in the Episcopal Church and the broader communion and the broader body of Christ.
When I was serving as Archbishop Sohail's chaplain several years ago, there'd been some violence downtown and at the Western Wall. Some people were hurt, and it was very unhappy and bad situation for several hours. And I met with an interfaith group trying to come up with a statement. It took an hour to come up with a statement between Jews, Muslims, and Christians that would condemn the violence. And I was frustrated by that. Of course, the issue is that the statement had to be the same, understood the same way, whether in English or Arabic or in Hebrew. So that took a little while anyway. But it took a long time to come to an agreement about a very brief statement to condemn violence. And I came back from that meeting and Archbishop Sohail said, well, how did it go, Bob? And I said, oh, Archbishop Sohail, it took an hour. It's ridiculous, blah, blah, blah. And I was really quite exercised about this and just disgusted. And he stood back and he said, well, he said, Bob, he said, what city do we live in? And I said, well, Jerusalem. And he said, and it's the city where what happened? I said, oh, the resurrection. And he said, we live in the city of hope.
Yeah.
And, I said, thanks a lot. You know, of course, he was right. Hope was rooted in our faith. Our faith is about hope. And when the chips are down and things look the worst and it's all Good Friday all over the place, as Christian people, we are confident that Easter morning is going to come around again. And in the midst of all that's to the contrary, hope does keep us alive. And Christians in the Middle East, whether they are expats or indigenous, whether they're in Iraq or Oman or in Jerusalem or Gaza or the West Bank or wherever they are, Syria, Jordan, pick one, they keep that hope alive and they live by that. And that's inspiration to me.
Thank you. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Emma. And Bob, not to embarrass you too much, but I know that you are retiring soon after many years of faithful service. So we're grateful for the work that you've done, especially in Jerusalem and the Middle East, and the wisdom that you've shared with us today and the wisdom you've been sharing for many years. So I'm grateful for that. And I'm hopeful as well in terms of people like Emma and your young adult service corps colleagues, Emma, who I think bring hope to many of us in terms of a strong and bright future for the Episcopal Church moving forward. So thank you, Emma, for your service, and we look forward to following your ministry in the coming years.